The rope around her wrists was not the thing that hurt most. It was the silence of the crowd, thousands of people she had once fed during the famine, now standing in a square built with her own gold, watching her kneel on a wooden platform and say nothing in her own defense, because no one had let her speak. Duchess Aelira Rothskane looked up at the man she had loved since she was 17 years old, the Emperor of Villainess, and she searched his face for even one flicker of doubt. She found none. "Do you have any final words, traitor?" The herald asked, and Aelira almost laughed, because the truest words of her life had been spoken 3 years earlier in a garden to a man who had smiled at her and lied. The blade came down before she could answer. And then instead of darkness there was a garden, the same warm spring wind, the same man 20 years old and not yet a stranger bowing over her hand for the very first time. Aelira Rothskane was alive, she was 19 again. And she had exactly 3 years to make sure that no one who had killed her would ever get the chance to do it twice. The scent hit her first. Jasmine, cut grass, and the particular sweetness of the Rothskane rose hedges that her mother had planted before she died. Aelira's knees buckled, and she caught herself on the stone edge of a fountain that had been rubble the last time she'd seen it, because the last time she'd seen it. The eastern wing of the palace gardens had already been burned down by rioters who blamed her for the grain shortage that killed their children, but the fountain was whole, the water was clear, and a hand was extended toward her, palm up, elegant, patient. "My lady, are you unwell?" She knew that voice. She had heard it whisper love in the dark and heard it 3 years later whisper her death sentence to the emperor's ear with the same gentle, reasonable tone. Duke Ivan Solving, 20 years old, golden-haired, soft-eyed, utterly convincing. The man who would one day plant forged letters in her private study, who would testify that she had poisoned the empress's tea. Who would stand in the front row of her execution wearing black, as if he mourned her, while the ink of her death warrant was still wet from his own signature as a witness. Aelira looked at his hand and did not take it. For one heartbeat, old instinct nearly won. Her body remembered loving him before her mind caught up to hating him. That was the cruelest part of dying and waking up again. The heart did not immediately understand what the memories were screaming. "Forgive me," she said instead, rising on her own. "I was overcome by the smell of jasmine. It reminds me of a dream I once had. A pleasant one, I hope." "No," she said, meeting his eyes for the first time without flinching. "A very instructive one." He blinked just once, a flicker of surprise at her tone, and she filed that reaction away the way she used to file away troop movements when she still believed she would live long enough to use the information. This was the first lesson of her second life. Every reaction was data. Every smile was a transaction. She had spent her first 19 years believing that kindness given freely would be returned freely. She had spent her last 3 years learning that kindness in the imperial court was simply a debt collected at the worst possible moment. She excused herself before he could offer his arm, and she walked the garden path alone, her mind racing faster than her feet. 3 years. She had 3 years before the accusation, before the forged letters, before the day the Empress's cup would be switched by a servant Ivan had bribed. A servant named Petra who worked in the eastern kitchen, and who Aelira had never once suspected. Because Petra used to bring her warm milk when she couldn't sleep as a child, she stopped walking, her hands were shaking. It was one thing to know in the abstract that betrayal was coming. It was another thing entirely to walk past the woman who would poison a future she hadn't yet earned and smile at her and say good morning. "Lady Rothskane," she turned. Her father's steward, old Bertrand, was hurrying toward her with a letter in hand. A letter she recognized instantly, because she had read its twin 100 times in her memory, turning it over and over on cold execution eve nights, wondering what she could have done differently. It was the invitation to the imperial spring ball, the night she had first truly caught the emperor's eye, the night everything beautiful and everything doomed had begun at once. "Shall I have your gowns prepared, my lady?" Bertrand asked. In her first life, she had spent 3 weeks choosing a dress the color of dawn, hoping to be noticed by a young emperor who was, at the time, still mourning his father and uncertain of his throne. She had succeeded. He had noticed her. He had fallen in love with her, or with the idea of her, and that love, twisted and starved of trust by whispering advisors, had eventually become the very blade that opened her throat. "Yes," Aelira said slowly, "but not dawn-colored this time, my lady. Prepare something in Rothskane blue." And Bertrand, she hesitated, feeling the old steward's loyal, worried eyes on her, a man who in her first life had wept at her trial and been dragged from the courtroom for it, and who had died of grief less than a year after her execution, alone. Guilt sat in her chest like a stone. "Thank you for your service to this family, all of it, past and future." Bertrand looked baffled by the sudden warmth, but he bowed, pleased, and hurried off. Aelira stood alone by the fountain and allowed herself, for the first time since waking, to cry not from grief, but from the strange, electric fury of possibility. She was not going to spend this life being noticed. She was going to spend it being ready. That night she did something she had never once done in her first 19 years. She went to her father's study after everyone was asleep, lit a single candle, and began writing down every name she could remember. Every conspirator, every bribe, every date. The forged letters would come from a court calligrapher named Duchess Aelira, hired quietly by Ivan 18 months from now. The poison would come from a black market apothecary in the Dock District, purchased through a merchant named Corvin Ash. The final fatal push, the whisper campaign that convinced the emperor she could not be trusted, would come not from Ivan alone but from someone closer to the throne. Someone who had stood beside the emperor at her execution wearing an expression of genuine, satisfied triumph that Aelira, in her dying moments, had been too devastated to properly question. She underlined that name twice: Grand Duchess Morgana Draveth, the emperor's own aunt. Aelira did not yet know why the emperor's aunt would want her dead, but she intended to find out carefully, patiently, and this time without ever again mistaking a smile for safety. Outside her window, the palace bells rang midnight, and somewhere across the capital, a young calligrapher named Duchess Aelira, not yet aware she would ever be asked to forge anything, was blowing out her own candle and going peacefully to sleep. Aelira watched the dark window and whispered to no one, not this time. The Rothskane townhouse woke to chaos 3 days later, and for once it had nothing to do with Aelira's plans. The East Grain warehouse, her father said grimly over breakfast, setting down a dispatch with hands that trembled slightly from age and worry. Rats got into the reserve stores, a quarter of it is spoiled. In her first life, Aelira remembered this exact morning only vaguely. She had been too consumed with ball gowns and gossip to pay attention to grain counts. 6 months later. That spoiled quarter had combined with a poor harvest to spark the food shortage that turned half the capital against House Rothskane, a shortage that Ivan's allies had quietly, cleverly blamed on her father's mismanagement, a rumor that later made it disturbingly easy for the court to believe she was capable of poisoning a woman for power. This time, Aelira set down her tea and said, "Father, may I see the warehouse ledgers?" Duke Rothskane blinked at his daughter as if she had asked to see the moon. "Ledgers are hardly a young lady's concern, Aelira." "Humor me," she said, with a small, deliberate smile, the first calculated smile of her new life. "I had a very strange dream about rats, warehouses, and a very hungry winter. I'd like to prove myself wrong." He allowed it, mostly out of affection and mild amusement. And by that evening, Aelira sat by candlelight cross-referencing shipment dates, with a mind that had spent 3 years in her first life doing nothing but planning her family's ruin obsessively, replaying every mistake. What she found chilled her. The warehouse steward, a man named Oscar Tull, had been quietly selling grain reserves on the side for over a year, replacing them with cheaper, poorly stored stock that spoiled fast. It wasn't sabotage. It was ordinary, mundane greed, the kind of small corruption that no one thought to look for because everyone assumed the real danger was always something grander. She almost laughed. Her death, in the end, had been caused by a conspiracy of powerful people. But the suffering that made that conspiracy believable, the hungry, angry crowd who wanted anyone to blame, had been caused by something as small as one dishonest steward. This is the lesson nobody teaches highborn children, she thought, staring at the ledgers. Empires do not fall from a single knife. They fall from 100 small neglects that someone patient enough gathers up and sharpens into one. The next morning she brought the evidence to her father, and Oscar Tull was quietly dismissed and the theft ring unraveled before it could spread. It was a small victory. It changed nothing about Ivan or Morgana or the throne. But it meant that 6 months from now, there would be no spoiled reserve, no food shortage, no hungry crowd primed to hate her before she'd even been accused of anything. She began to understand something in those weeks that would guide every decision afterward. Revenge built on hatred alone was brittle. It broke the moment your enemy found a weakness in you. But revenge built on preparation, on quietly making yourself and your people less vulnerable brick by brick, was something no whispering campaign could burn down. At the week's end, a letter arrived that made her blood run cold in a different way. It was an invitation, gilt-edged, embossed with the imperial seal, inviting Duke Rothskane and his daughter to a private garden reception hosted by Grand Duchess Morgana. In her first life, Aelira had received this exact invitation and had been thrilled by it, utterly unaware that she was being quietly appraised like livestock by the woman who would one day help sentence her to death. This time she read it 3 times, feeling the old fear rise, and beneath the fear something sharper and more useful. Fury, yes, but also curiosity. Because if Morgana was watching her this early, 3 full years before the execution, then whatever grudge the Grand Duchess held against House Rothskane did not begin with jealousy over the Emperor's affections at all. It began before that. It began with something Aelira, in her first life, had never once thought to ask about. "What did my family ever do to you?" She wrote back, accepting the invitation with a hand that did not shake, even though everything in her wanted to burn the letter instead. Then she called for her maid Sable, a quiet, watchful young woman who in Aelira's first life had been dismissed from service for disloyalty a year before the execution, and who Aelira had never once wondered about again. Too wrapped up in her own unraveling world to notice a servant's dismissal. "Sable," Aelira said carefully, studying the young woman's face for the first time as if seeing her clearly. "I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, not a courtly one." Sable's eyes flickered with something like surprise and beneath it wariness. "Of course, my lady. Do you know anything about the Grand Duchess? Old history, servants, gossip, anything at all connecting her to my father's house?" There was a long pause. Long enough that Aelira knew, with sudden certainty, that she had asked the right question of the right person, and that Sable was deciding in real time how much of the truth was safe to give her. "My lady," Sable said finally, voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "my grandmother served in this house 40 years ago. She used to say there was a scandal before you were born. Something to do with your father and the old Emperor's sister, not Duchess Morgana, my lady. Her sister, the one who died young, the one nobody talks about." Aelira's teacup rattled softly against its saucer. She had walked into that garden reception in her first life utterly blind, charmed by golden hair and careful compliments. Never once suspecting that the woman quietly measuring her for a coffin had buried a sister 30 years before Aelira had even been born. And somehow somewhere in that old grief house Rothskane's name was written. The Grand Duchess's garden reception was smaller than Aelira remembered. No more than 40 guests scattered across a terrace draped in white silk and early lilies, and Morgana Draveth herself was nothing like the cold, triumphant figure who had stood at Aelira's execution 3 years from now with her chin lifted in quiet satisfaction. Here, in this earlier version of her, Morgana was still beautiful in the sharp, brittle way of a woman who had decided long ago that softness was a luxury she couldn't afford. She wore black and silver, though it was spring and everyone else wore pastels, and when her eyes landed on Aelira across the terrace, something in her expression tightened, not hatred exactly. Recognition. As if Aelira's face reminded her of someone. Her sister, Aelira realized with a jolt. "I must look like her sister." "Lady Rothskane," Morgana said when Aelira was finally brought before her, her voice smooth as poured cream, betraying nothing. "How is your father's health?" "Well, your grace, thank you for asking." "And his memory?" A pause delicate as a blade's edge. "Is it also well?" The question was strange enough that Aelira's old self in her first life would have simply smiled and moved on, chalking it up to court eccentricity. But Aelira had died once already for failing to notice small strangenesses, and she was done making that mistake. "His memory is excellent, your grace," she said carefully. "Though I confess I know little of anything that happened before my own birth. Was there something in particular you wished him to remember?" Morgana's eyes, pale gray, unnervingly still, studied her for a long moment. Around them the party continued, laughter and clinking glasses, utterly unaware that something old and dangerous was being weighed in the silence between 2 women. "There was a woman once," Morgana said finally, so quietly that Aelira had to lean in to hear her over the music. "My younger sister Isel, she loved your father before he married your mother. She believed he loved her in return." A brittle smile. She was wrong, or perhaps she was simply inconvenient once a better match presented itself. She died 2 years after he broke the engagement. The healers called it a wasting sickness. I have always called it something else. Aelira felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of her entire family history. In her first life, she had never known any of this, had never had reason to ask, had never lived long enough after the execution to piece together why a woman she'd met only a handful of times had wanted her dead with such quiet, patient thoroughness. It wasn't politics, it wasn't even truly about the Emperor's affection. It was 30-year-old grief, curdled into something that needed a Rothskane daughter to suffer for a Rothskane son's old cruelty. "Your grace," Aelira said carefully, choosing every word as if it were a stone she was placing on a bridge she needed to survive crossing. "I am deeply sorry for your sister's pain. I mean that with my whole heart, not as courtly performance. But I was not born when this happened. I did not choose my father's choices. She paused, and then because the old Aelira would have stopped there out of politeness, and the new Aelira refused to leave anything unsaid that might save her life. She added, "If there is a debt owed for old wrongs, your grace, I would rather know it and answer for it honestly than discover it only when it has already been paid in blood. I don't understand, I'm bleeding." Something shifted in Morgana's face. Surprise first. Then briefly something almost like respect, quickly hidden away, the way a woman hides a weakness in a den of wolves. "You are not what I expected, Lady Rothskane. What did you expect? Someone shallow, someone I could dislike easily." Morgana's smile turned thin and unreadable again. It is inconvenient when the world refuses to be simple. She turned and walked away before Aelira could respond, leaving her standing alone on the terrace with her heart hammering and her mind racing through 100 new possibilities. In her first life, this conversation had never happened. In her first life, she had died without ever knowing that the woman who helped condemn her was not motivated by court politics at all, but by an old and unhealed wound that had nothing to do with Aelira personally. That night, walking home in the carriage, her father asked idly how the reception had gone, and Aelira almost told him everything, almost asked him directly about a woman named Isel who had loved him once and died believing he'd thrown her away. She didn't, not yet. She needed to know more before she reopened a wound that old and that dangerous, on a man she needed thinking clearly for what was coming. Instead she asked, "Father, did you know an imperial lady named Isel Draveth many years ago?" Her father's face went the color of old parchment. His hand, resting on his cane, tightened until his knuckles whitened. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, and his voice was not the warm, steady voice she knew. It was the voice of a much younger, much more frightened man. Aelira understood in that moment that she had just pulled the first thread of a much older, much larger tapestry than she had ever imagined, and that unraveling it carefully without cutting herself on what lay beneath was going to require every ounce of patience her second life had taught her. "I heard it from Grand Duchess Morgana," she said quietly. "She says her sister died believing you abandoned her for a better match. She says she has always believed it was murder, not sickness." Her father did not speak again for the rest of the carriage ride home. When they arrived, he went straight to his study and did not come out for supper. Aelira stood outside his door for a long time before finally walking away, understanding with cold clarity that the true story of her death had never truly begun with Ivan Solvain's ambition at all. It had begun decades earlier, in a broken engagement she'd known nothing about, and if she wanted to survive this second life, she was going to have to solve a mystery that was older than she was. It was General Kaelin Ashford who found her sitting alone in the palace archive 3 weeks later, surrounded by decades-old correspondence she had bribed a sympathetic clerk to let her access, her fingers stained with dust and old ink. In her first life, Aelira had barely known Kaelin Ashford. He was a quiet, serious young officer, the youngest general in imperial history, more comfortable on a drill field than a ballroom, and she remembered him now only in fragments, mostly as a stern face in the back of the courtroom on the day of her trial. The only person present who had stood up uninvited and demanded to know why no physician's testimony had been allowed regarding the Empress's actual cause of death. He had been dragged out by the guards. She had been too consumed by her own terror to properly thank him, and 3 days later she was dead, and she had never learned what happened to the one man in that courtroom who had tried, however briefly, to fight for her. Lady Rothskane. His voice was low, careful, the voice of a man unused to speaking in libraries. "Forgive the intrusion, I was told the Eastern Archive was unoccupied. It's quite all right, General." She straightened, aware suddenly of how she must look, hair coming loose, ink on her fingers, surrounded by papers no highborn lady should have any interest in. "I was doing some family research, a tedious business but necessary." His eyes, dark, steady, entirely too perceptive, moved over the papers spread across the table, lingering on a name she hadn't managed to hide in time, Isel Draveth. "That's an old name," he said carefully. "My father served under the old emperor. He mentioned her once years ago." There were questions at the time about how she died. Aelira's pulse quickened. What kind of questions? Kaelin hesitated, clearly weighing how much a stranger, however highborn, deserved to know about a decades-old palace secret. Then something in her face must have convinced him, because he pulled out the chair across from her and sat, lowering his voice. "My father said the healer who treated Lady Isel in her final months was dismissed from imperial service immediately after her death, with a very generous pension, and a very firm instruction never to speak of the case again. He said it wasn't the kind of dismissal you give an incompetent healer, it was the kind you give a witness." "A witness to what?" "That," Kaelin said quietly, "is the question nobody was ever brave enough to ask twice." Aelira studied him, This quiet, serious man who, in her first life, had been the only voice raised in her defense, while everyone else she'd loved stayed silent or actively condemned her. She thought about how differently things might have gone if she had trusted him 3 years earlier instead of 3 days before her death. "General Ashford," she said slowly, "may I ask you something and trust that it will not leave this room?" "You may." "If you discovered evidence, real evidence, not rumor, that a member of the imperial family had committed a serious crime decades ago, and that this crime was still shaping events today, what would you do with that knowledge?" Kalen didn't answer immediately. He was, she remembered now, a man who thought carefully before he spoke, a trait the court mistook for slowness and Aelira now recognized as simple integrity. "I would want to know the truth completely before acting," he said finally. "A half-truth in the wrong hands has started more wars than outright lies ever have, but I would not bury it, whatever it costs." He met her eyes directly. "Why do you ask, my lady, what have you found?" She almost told him everything, right there, 3 weeks into a second life she was still learning to trust. The words rose in her throat. "I have died once already, General, and you were the only one who tried to save me, and I don't know how to tell you that without sounding insane." But she swallowed them back down, old caution winning over new desperation. "Nothing certain yet," she said instead. "Only threads. I intend to keep pulling at them." "Then be careful which threads you pull, Lady Rothskane." His voice was quiet, and there was something in it not quite warning, not quite plea, that made her chest ache in a way she didn't fully understand. The palace has a way of punishing people who see too clearly. "You have no idea," she thought, "how right you are." He rose to leave, and at the door he paused, glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something careful. Something that looked almost like recognition, as though some part of him, too, sensed that this conversation mattered more than either of them could explain. "If your threads lead somewhere dangerous," he said, "you needn't pull them alone." Then he was gone, and Aelira sat alone in the archive for a long time afterwards, staring at the space where he'd been standing. Feeling something crack open in her chest that she had thought had died along with her first life, a small, stubborn, foolish hope that perhaps not everyone in this gilded, treacherous court was destined to fail her. She gathered her papers with trembling hands. Somewhere out there, a healer who had been paid to disappear 30 years ago might still be alive. Somewhere out there was the truth about Aisel Draveth's death, and Aelira was beginning to suspect, with cold, creeping certainty, that the truth might implicate someone even closer to her own family than her father's broken engagement. She thought of Ivan Solvain's easy smile. She thought of the servant Petra, who would one day switch a poisoned cup. She thought of a court calligrapher who hadn't yet been asked to forge a letter, and a merchant who hadn't yet sold black market poison, and an emperor who hadn't yet learned to doubt her. And she thought, every conspiracy has a beginning. I have simply been looking at the wrong ending. It took 6 weeks, 4 bribed clerks, 2 false lids, and 1 deeply uncomfortable conversation with a retired midwife before Aelira finally found her. Greta Van. Once the personal healer to Lady Aisel Draveth, now living under a different surname in a modest cottage 2 days. Ride from the capital in a village so small it didn't appear on most official maps. Aelira went alone, telling her father only that she was visiting a friend from her mother's side of the family. A lie that tasted bitter in her mouth, given how carefully she was trying to protect him, but a necessary one. Sable came with her, quiet and watchful as always, and Kalen Ashford, whom Aelira had, after much internal debate, finally decided to trust with a carefully edited version of the truth, arranged a discreet military escort under the guise of a routine patrol. Greta Van was an old woman, now silver-haired, her hands gnarled with age and old work, and when Aelira introduced herself at the cottage door, the color drained entirely from the healer's face. "Rothskane," Greta whispered. "I wondered if this day would come." She let them in without further prompting, as if 30 years of silence had simply been waiting, patiently coiled like a spring, for someone to finally ask the right question. "I did not kill her," Greta said before Aelira could even speak, her voice cracking with old, unspent grief. "I want that understood first. I loved Lady Aisel. I tried everything I knew to save her. But what was making her sick was not a wasting fever, my lady. It was slow poison, arsenic, administered in small, careful doses over nearly a year, disguised as a treatment for melancholy. By the time I understood what was truly happening, it was too late to reverse the damage. And when I tried to report it, her hands trembled around her teacup. I was visited quietly by a woman who offered me a very generous pension and a very clear warning about what would happen to my own daughter if I ever spoke the truth to anyone." Aelira's blood went cold. "Who visited you?" "I never learned her name. She wore imperial colors but no house crest I recognized. Young at the time, younger than the Grand Duchess is now, sharp-eyed, calm in a way that frightened me more than shouting ever could have. Do you remember anything else about her? Anything at all? Greta was quiet for a long moment, staring into her tea as if the answer might be floating there 30 years submerged. She wore a ring, she said finally. Unusual, a black pearl set in silver, shaped like a coiled serpent. I remember because Lady Aisel had commented on it once before she fell ill. She said it belonged to an old minor noble house that had mostly died out. I don't recall which one. Aelira's mind raced. A ring, a house crest deliberately hidden, a woman calm enough to threaten a healer's child without raising her voice. This was not the profile of a jealous rival or a grieving relative. This was someone who had been patiently working toward some larger goal for at least 30 years. Someone who had poisoned an imperial lady, silenced the only witness, and then if Aelira's growing suspicion was correct, waited decades before orchestrating the downfall of House Rothskane through Ivan solving and a poisoned cup meant for the Empress. A pattern, Aelira realized, her stomach twisting with dawning horror. Poison used slowly and quietly, disguised as illness or as someone else's crime. Twice, 30 years apart, the same method. Possibly the same hand. Mistress Van, Aelira said carefully, I need to ask you something difficult. Do you believe is it possible that whoever poisoned Lady Aisel might still be active in the palace today? Greta's eyes, old and tired and finally after 30 years allowed to be afraid out loud, met Aelira's own. My lady, she said quietly, I have spent 30 years praying you would never have reason to ask me that question. I am so sorry that you do. Outside. The sun was beginning to set over the quiet village, and somewhere back in the capital Aelira knew the machinery of her own eventual death was still turning. Ivan solving growing more ambitious, by the season, a calligrapher not yet approached, a servant not yet bribed. A poison not yet purchased. But now she understood something she hadn't understood even in the moment of her execution. The hand guiding all of it might not belong to Ivan at all, or even to Morgana's decades-old grief. It might belong to someone patient enough and hidden enough to have been killing quietly for 30 years and never once been caught. She left the cottage with a description of a serpent ring and a promise to protect Greta and her family. And on the ride back to the capital in the dark, with Kaelin's quiet, watchful presence riding just behind her carriage, Aelira allowed herself finally to say the thought aloud that had been building in her chest for weeks. Sable, she said softly, I don't think I was ever meant to be the true target at all. I think I was simply standing in the way of something much older than me. Sable, uncharacteristically, reached over and took her hand, a small, human gesture that no lady's maid would ever dare in her first life, and one that Aelira, in this life, found she needed more than she could say. Then we find out what that something is, Sable said simply. And we make sure it never reaches you again. For the first time since waking in the garden 3 months ago, Aelira let herself believe cautiously, fiercely, that she might not be facing this alone after all. The serpent ring haunted her for months. Aelira searched genealogical records, questioned jewelers, and quietly commissioned a court artist to sketch every minor noble house crest that had gone extinct in the last 50 years, all without success until almost by accident. She found it in the one place she had never thought to look, her own family's guest ledgers, House Fedor. A minor noble line mostly absorbed into other families through marriage 2 generations ago, its last surviving name-bearer a quiet, unremarkable court administrator named Baron Korin Fedor, the emperor's own chief secretary, a man so unassuming that Aelira in her first life had walked past him in palace hallways 100 times without once truly seeing him. She stared at the ledger entry, a visit from Lady Fedor to the Rothskane estate 29 years ago, listed with no further explanation, and felt the last piece of a horrible picture slide into place. Baron Fedor did not simply serve the emperor. He had served the emperor's father before him and his father before that. He had access to every private letter, every physician's report, every quiet secret the crown had ever tried to bury. He was the perfect instrument for a 30-year campaign of patient, invisible poison, not because he wielded the knife himself necessarily, but because he was positioned precisely to make sure no one else ever noticed the pattern. Aelira brought her findings to Kaelin Ashford in the dead of night. In a private meeting room in the officers' quarters that he'd secured under the pretense of discussing border patrol logistics, and watched his face go through disbelief, then dawning horror, then the particular stillness of a soldier calculating how much danger they had just walked into. If you're right, he said slowly, then the man closest to the emperor's ear, the man who reads every dispatch before the emperor does, has been quietly murdering members of this court for 30 years, and no one has ever suspected him because he is the single most boring man in the entire palace. That's precisely why no one suspected him, Aelira said. Nobody watches the man who simply carries the letters. Everyone watches the man who wants to be watched. Then why would he target you? A poisoned imperial lady 30 years ago. I understand, old scandal, old blackmail, motive enough. But you're a duke's daughter with no political power of her own. What could you possibly threaten? Aelira had turned this exact question over for weeks, lying awake at night, forcing herself to think not as a victim but as a strategist. And slowly, painfully, an answer had begun to form, one she hadn't wanted to accept because it meant her death had never truly been about her at all. I don't think it was ever about me specifically, she said quietly. I think it was about my father. Baron Fedor served the old emperor directly. If Isel Dravith's poisoning were ever exposed, the trail would eventually lead back to whoever benefited from her death, and I believe, General, that the true beneficiary was never a jilted lover's revenge at all. I believe my father was being blackmailed. Quietly for decades, and I believe that when he finally showed signs of resisting that blackmail 3 years from the point I am telling you about. In a future I have already lived once, Baron Fedor decided the simplest solution was to remove the leverage that made him vulnerable to exposure by having my father's daughter destroyed instead, using Ivan Solvain's ambition as a convenient, deniable weapon. Kalen was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and grim. You said a future you have already lived. My lady, I've noticed you say things like that more than once. Careful phrases. Things a person says when they know more than they should be able to know. Aelira's heart stopped. She had been careless. 3 months of caution, of careful edited half-truths, undone by exhaustion and grief in a single unguarded sentence. Kalen, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name aloud. If I told you something that sounded impossible, would you believe me, or would you have me quietly committed to an asylum for the Emperor's own safety? Something in his face softened, not doubt, but a kind of fierce, protective steadiness that she would spend the rest of this new life being grateful for. Try me, he said simply. I have watched you these past months solve mysteries no one else in this court even noticed existed. I don't think you're mad, Aelira. I think you're the only person in this entire palace who's been telling the truth. And so in a dim officers' meeting room at midnight, with a stranger's map of a conspiracy laid out between them on the table, Aelira Rothskane told General Kalen Ashford the entire truth of her death. The false accusation, the poisoned empress, the forged letters, the blade coming down. And the garden she had woken up in 3 years earlier, given a second chance she had sworn to use wisely. When she finished, the room was silent except for the guttering candle between them. I believe you, Kalen said finally, quietly, and something in Aelira's chest that had been clenched tight for 3 long months of solitary secrecy finally, gratefully let go. I don't fully understand how such a thing is possible, but I believe you. And I swear to you now, my lady, whatever comes, whatever Baron Fedor and Ivan Solvain have planned, you will not face it as you did the first time. Alone, unheard, and unbelieved. Outside, the palace clock struck 2, and somewhere in his quiet, unremarkable quarters, Baron Corin Fedor slept soundly, utterly unaware that the woman he had once condemned to death in a life she would never speak of again had just found the first true ally of her second one. By the time the second spring arrived, 1 full year into her new life, Aelira had built quietly and carefully the beginnings of a network. Kalen Ashford and his most trusted officers, Sable, and her surprisingly extensive web of servant contacts across a dozen noble households, old Bertrand, whose loyalty proved worth more than a battalion, and cautiously her father, to whom she had finally told a carefully softened version of the truth about Baron Fedor's blackmail, watching decades of guilt and fear finally crack open into resolve on his weathered face. What she had not built yet was a plan for Ivan Solvain, because Ivan in her first life had not simply been a pawn of Fedor's scheme. He had been ambitious enough and cruel enough to want her ruin for his own reasons once the opportunity was dangled in front of him. And ambition, Aelira had learned, was far harder to outmaneuver than a simple 30-year-old blackmail scheme, because ambition adapted. She found this out the hard way on a warm evening in the palace's east wing when Ivan, golden smiling, utterly convincing, cornered her in a quiet alcove during the Emperor's spring reception and pressed a folded letter into her hand with a smile that this time Aelira recognized immediately for the performance it was. A gift, he said softly, from someone who admires your father's position at court. Consider it an investment in continued cooperation. Aelira unfolded the letter with steady hands and found, exactly as she'd expected, a forged document clumsily backdated, purportedly showing her father conspiring with a rival noble house against the crown. In her first life, this letter, or one very much like it, had been the seed of the accusation that eventually grew into treason charges leveled against her, once the more damning poisoning evidence was added a year later. "This is a forgery," she said calmly, refolding it. "Rather clumsily done, if I'm honest. The seal wax is the wrong shade of crimson. House Ashvane uses vermilion, not scarlet. Whoever commissioned this should demand a refund." Ivan's charming smile flickered just slightly, just enough. "That's a very confident accusation for a lady to make about a document she's never seen before tonight. I have an excellent eye for detail, Duke Solving." She held his gaze, unflinching, letting 3 years of buried fury finally surface, controlled and cold. "I also have an excellent memory for men who smile at me in gardens while planning my ruin behind closed doors." The color drained slowly from his face. "I don't know what you mean. I think you do." She stepped closer, lowering her voice to something only he could hear, letting every ounce of quiet, deadly certainty she'd earned across a year of Second Life preparation bleed into her words. "I know about the calligrapher you haven't hired yet. I know about the poison you haven't purchased yet. I know about the servant in the Eastern kitchen you haven't bribed yet. And I know, Duke Solving, that when all of it finally comes together, you intend to stand at my execution wearing black, as if you grieve me, while the ink on my death warrant is still wet with your own testimony." Ivan Solving stared at her as though she had grown a second head, his careful court composure entirely abandoned, real fear finally cracking through the golden charm for the first time since she'd met him in this life. "That's not, I would never." "You will," Aelira said simply, "unless you make a very different choice starting tonight." She held up the forged letter between them. "I am not going to expose you publicly, not yet. A cornered animal is dangerous, and I have learned at great cost exactly how dangerous you can be. Instead, I am going to give you a choice that no one gave me the first time around. Walk away from Baron Fedor's scheme tonight, and I will ensure you leave this court quietly, disgraced perhaps, but alive and unpunished for crimes you haven't committed yet. Or continue down this path, and I promise you, Duke Solving, that I have spent an entire year preparing for exactly this moment, and I will not be the one standing on the executioner's platform when it ends." For a long, taut moment, Ivan said nothing at all, his eyes searching her face for some sign that this was a trick, a bluff, a test he might still pass by calling it correctly. He found none, because it wasn't a bluff. "Who are you?" he whispered finally, genuine bewilderment cutting through the fear. "You are not the girl I met a year ago." "No," Aelira agreed quietly. "I am the woman that girl became after she learned exactly what your smile was worth." She turned and walked away before he could respond, her heart hammering so hard she thought the entire reception hall must be able to hear it. And it was only once she reached the safety of a servant's corridor out of sight that she allowed herself to lean against the cold stone wall and shake. She had just done something she had spent a year carefully planning never to do. She had shown her hand openly to one of the very people who had helped kill her. It was a risk, a terrible, enormous risk, but she had made a calculation that her first life had never given her the luxury of making. Ivan Solving was ambitious, yes, and cruel when it served him. But he was not, she had come to believe over a year of careful observation, a man who wanted to be a murderer. He wanted power and status and the Emperor's favor, and he had simply never been given a reason to believe that betraying House Rothskane would cost him more than it gained. Now he had that reason. What she did not know, what she could not have known. Standing alone in that dark corridor with her pulse finally beginning to slow, was that Baron Corin Fedor's most trusted spy had been standing just 3 feet away throughout the entire exchange, hidden behind a tapestry, and that within the hour. Word of Aelira Rothskane's impossible knowledge would reach the one man in the entire empire, who had every reason 30 years running to make absolutely certain that she never lived long enough to expose him. 2 days after her confrontation with Ivan, Aelira woke to find Sable standing frozen in her bedroom doorway, pale as candle wax, a folded note trembling in her hand. "My lady," Sable whispered, "Bertrand is missing." The old steward had not returned from his usual evening walk to the market district. His room had not been slept in, and on his empty desk, precisely centered, someone had left a single black pearl set in silver shaped like a coiled serpent. Aelira understood the message immediately, and her blood turned to ice. "I know that you know, and I can reach anyone you love whenever I choose." She did not scream or weep or fall apart. A year of preparation had burned that instinct out of her, replaced with something colder and more useful. Instead, she dressed with shaking but deliberate hands, sent Sable racing to fetch Kaelin Ashford, and began methodically tearing apart every scrap of information she had gathered over the past year to find whatever thread Baron Fedor might have pulled to locate Bertrand. Kaelin arrived within the hour, already in half armor, his face carved from granite. My men are searching the dock district and the market quarter. If Fedor has him, he won't kill him immediately. A dead steward raises questions. A missing one quietly does not. Unless he needs to send a message, Aelira said, staring at the serpent ring on Bertrand's desk, which I think he's already sent. They found Bertrand 4 hours later, alive but badly shaken, locked in the cellar of an abandoned dockside warehouse, bound but unharmed beyond a few bruises from a struggle. He had been intercepted on his walk, blindfolded, and interrogated by 2 men in unmarked cloaks about the young mistress's recent activities. Questions he had, loyally and stubbornly, refused to answer even under threat. They wanted to know who you'd been meeting, Bertrand told Aelira later, wrapped in blankets by his own hearth, his voice still unsteady. Military men, healers, anyone connected to old scandals. My lady, I said nothing, but I fear my silence itself may have told them everything they needed to know. Aelira knelt beside his chair and took his weathered hand in both of hers, guilt and fury warring in her chest in equal measure. This is my fault. I moved too quickly. I confronted Ivan before I had a plan for what would happen if word reached Fedor. You confronted a murderer's accomplice to protect your family's future, Bertrand said firmly, some of his old steel returning to his voice. That is not foolishness, my lady. That is courage. The fault lies entirely with the man who ordered my abduction, not the woman brave enough to threaten his scheme. That night, gathered in the Rothskane study with her father, Kaelin, Sable, and a still-shaken but resolute Bertrand, Aelira laid out the terrible new reality they faced. Baron Fedor knew, or at least strongly suspected, that someone was investigating him. He had already demonstrated a willingness to abduct and interrogate a member of her own household. And he held a position at the very right hand of the Emperor, with access to every secret, every dispatch, every private moment of the crown, meaning that whatever they did next, they had to assume he would hear about it almost immediately. We cannot outmaneuver a man who reads the Emperor's mail before the Emperor does, Kaelin said grimly. Not through court politics, not quietly. Then we don't outmaneuver him quietly, Aelira said, and for the first time since waking in that garden a year ago, she felt something shift inside her, not fear finally, but the cold, clear clarity of a woman who had run out of patience for half measures. We force him into the open, in front of the one person whose judgment he cannot buy, bribe, or blackmail. We take this directly to the Emperor. Her father went pale. Aelira, the Emperor barely knows you exist yet in this life. You would be accusing his most trusted secretary, a man who has served the throne faithfully for 3 generations, of murder, blackmail, and abduction, based on a 30-year-old healer's testimony and a ring no one else has seen. I know, Aelira said quietly. Which is why we're not going to walk in with accusations. We're going to walk in with proof so complete that even a man who trusts Fedor completely cannot look away from it. And father, she turned to him, and for a moment the fierce, calculating strategist fell away, and she was simply his daughter again, frightened and determined in equal measure. I need you to tell me the truth about what Baron Fedor has held over you for 30 years. All of it, because I think it's the final piece we need, and I think you've been carrying it alone long enough. Duke Rothskane's face crumpled, decades of carefully guarded shame finally breaking loose, and in the flickering candlelight of the family study, he began at last to speak. I did not kill Aisel Dravith, her father said first, his voice raw. I want you to know that before anything else. I loved her once foolishly before I met your mother, and when I ended our engagement to marry for the alliance my own father demanded, I broke her heart, but I never once wished her harm. When she died 2 years later, I grieved. I did not yet know it was murder. He explained how 6 months after Aisel's death, a young court administrator named Corin Fedor had approached him quietly with a proposition disguised as sympathy. He possessed documents he claimed, proving that Duke Rothskane's broken engagement had driven Lady Aisel to a fatal decline. Documents that, if made public, would destroy the Rothskane family's honor and standing at court forever. For his silence, Fedor asked only for small favors at first, minor political support, quiet influence, nothing that seemed to cost much. But the favors never stopped, her father said, his hands trembling around his empty teacup. They grew larger every year, trade concessions. Votes in council I didn't truly believe in. Silence about corruption I should have spoken against. Each time I told myself it was the last time, and each time Fedor found a new document, a new threat, a new reason I could not refuse him. I did not know he had actually poisoned her, Aelira. I believed all these years that I was simply protecting my family from an old scandal born of my own genuine guilt. I did not know I was protecting a murderer. Aelira listened to her father's confession with a strange, aching mixture of fury and grief. fury at the 3 decades of manipulation that had slowly bent a good man into Fedor's unwitting instrument, and grief for the version of herself in her first life, who had died without ever understanding any of it, who had gone to the executioner's block believing her death was simply bad luck and court politics, when in truth it was the final brutal chapter of a conspiracy 3 decades in the making. "Why did he finally turn against me specifically?" she asked quietly. "In my first life, what changed?" Her father was silent for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice was almost too quiet to hear. 3 years from now, from tonight, I mean in the timeline you remember, I intended to refuse him. Truly refuse him for the first time in 30 years. I had grown too old, too tired of the weight of it, and I had decided I would rather face public scandal than continue protecting a man I'd finally come to suspect was far more dangerous than a broken engagement's fallout. I never told you this in whatever version of events you lived before. I never had the chance. His voice broke. I believe now, hearing everything you've told me, that Fedor discovered my intention to resist him and calculated that the most efficient way to guarantee my continued silence, permanently, was to destroy the one thing that could still be used to control me. Not documents, not scandal, you. My daughter, my legacy. He did not merely orchestrate your death to eliminate a witness, Aelira. He orchestrated it to punish me and to ensure that whatever remained of House Rothskane's future would never again have the strength or the will to defy him. The study was silent except for the soft crackle of the fire. Aelira sat very still, feeling the last terrible piece of the puzzle settle into place, the true, ugly shape of her own death finally visible after a year of careful, patient digging. She had not died because of a poisoned cup or a forged letter or even Ivan Solvain's ambition, though all of those things had been the instruments. She had died because a frightened old man, 30 years into an impossible blackmail, had finally found the courage to say no, and Baron Korin Fedor had answered that courage by murdering his daughter to make certain it never happened again. Then we are done being afraid of him, Aelira said quietly, and there was something in her voice now that made everyone in the room sit up straighter, not the careful, calculating tone of a strategist anymore, but something fiercer, older, forged in a life she had already lost once and refused to lose again. "Father, I need you to do the bravest thing you have ever done. I need you to refuse him again, now a year early before he expects it, while we still have the advantage of surprise. And this time you will not refuse him alone." Her father looked at his daughter, really looked at her, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman she had quietly become over the past year of secret investigations and midnight strategy sessions, and something in his broken, guilt-worn face steadied finally into resolve. "Tell me what to do," he said. Kalen leaned forward, his soldier's mind already turning toward tactics. "We need the Emperor to hear this directly from multiple credible sources in a setting Fedor cannot control or interrupt. A public council session would be too dangerous. Fedor has allies there who could suppress the accusation before it's fully heard. It needs to be private but witnessed by people the Emperor trusts absolutely." "The Emperor trusts almost no one absolutely," Aelira said, "except perhaps one person." She thought of him then, truly thought of him, for the first time in months, the young emperor she had once loved and who had once ordered her death without ever truly hearing her voice. In this life, she had kept her distance from him deliberately, afraid of repeating old mistakes, afraid of falling again into a love that had once ended in betrayal. But now, staring down the final confrontation of a war she'd been fighting quietly for a year, she understood that there was no path forward that did not, eventually, require her to trust him carefully, with open eyes this time, but trust him nonetheless. "Grand Duchess Morgana," she said slowly, "his aunt. She has no love for House Rothskane, given everything I now understand about her sister's death. But I believe, if we can show her that Fedor is the true architect of Isel's murder, and not my father alone, she will want him exposed more than anyone alive. And her testimony, alongside the Emperor's own trust in her, might be the one thing Fedor cannot buy or silence." It was, everyone in the room silently agreed, an enormous gamble, asking a woman who had every reason to despise House Rothskane to become its unlikely ally against a common enemy. But Aelira had learned, across a year of Second Life patience, that the most dangerous alliances were often the ones built not on friendship, but on a shared, unbreakable understanding of exactly what needed to be destroyed. "Then that is where we begin," she said, rising from her chair with the quiet, unshakable resolve of a woman who had died once already and refused, absolutely refused, to let that death mean nothing. "Tomorrow, I request an audience with Grand Duchess Morgana. And this time, I will not be the one who is unprepared. The private audience Aelira requested with Grand Duchess Morgana took place 3 days later in a small unmarked receiving room deep in the palace, attended only by Morgana herself, Aelira her father Kaelin Ashford in dress uniform. And waiting nervously in an adjoining chamber healer, Greta Van brought quietly and carefully back to the capital under armed escort. Aelira laid out everything: the poisoning of Isel Draveth 30 years ago, Greta's testimony, the serpent ring, the decades of blackmail against her father Bertrand's abduction, and finally, the terrible truth that Baron Corin Fedor had been the architect of it all, using old grief and older secrets to bind an entire noble house to his will for 3 long decades. She did not mention her first death. That truth, she had decided, belonged only to the people who needed to carry it to protect her, Kaelin, and now perhaps no one else ever again. Grand Duchess Morgana listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, her hands folded with perfect, brittle stillness in her lap. When Aelira finally finished and Greta was brought in, trembling but resolute, to confirm every detail of a story she had carried in silence for 30 years, Morgana sat for a long moment in complete, terrible silence. Then quietly she began to weep, the first crack in 30 years of carefully maintained composure. Grief finally allowed to surface for a sister she had spent 3 decades believing had simply been unlucky in love. "I have hated your family for 30 years, Morgana said finally, her voice raw, looking directly at Aelira. "I built an entire private grief around the belief that your father's cruelty killed my sister. And all this time, the truth was standing in the very room where I signed my correspondence, wearing the Emperor's own trust like a second skin, watching me hate the wrong family for 3 decades while he laughed quietly at how easily grief could be redirected." "You are not wrong to have grieved her, Your Grace," Aelira said gently, "only wrong about where to place the blame. I understand that grief does not simply dissolve because its target changes. But I believe together we can make certain that the truth finally reaches the one man capable of ending this, permanently and publicly, so that no one else's family is ever destroyed to protect Baron Fedor's secrets again." Morgana wiped her eyes with a steadiness that returned slowly, like a soldier reassembling armor after a wound. "The Emperor holds council in 2 days. I will arrange a private audience beforehand myself, you, your father, and this healer. I will vouch for the truth of it personally. Whatever else I am, Lady Rothskane, I am not a woman who protects murderers once I know their names." The private audience with the Emperor, when it finally came, was everything Aelira had spent a year preparing for, and nothing like the terrified, silent trial of her first life. This time she stood before him not as an accused traitor with no voice, but as a woman who had spent a year building an unbreakable case, flanked by allies who believed her completely, presenting evidence a frightened Emperor's secretary could not simply erase or bury. Baron Corin Fedor was summoned unaware of what awaited him, and Aelira watched, with a satisfaction that felt finally less like revenge and more like justice long overdue, as 30 years of careful invisible manipulation crumbled in the space of 20 minutes, undone by a healer's decades-old testimony. A serpent ring and the unshakable alliance of a grieving aunt and a family finally brave enough to speak. Fedor did not confess easily. He raged first, then pleaded, then attempted, with the same cold, patient cruelty that had sustained him for 30 years, to twist the accusations back onto Duke Rothskane himself. But the evidence was too complete, the witnesses too credible, and the Emperor, watching his most trusted secretary reveal, in real time, the calculating monster who had been standing at his right hand his entire reign, ordered his immediate arrest before the audience had even fully concluded. "Lady Rothskane," the Emperor said afterward, once the guards had led Fedor away, his voice quiet with something that might have been wonder, or might have been the first stirring of the same fascination that had, in another life, grown into a love that eventually destroyed her. "I do not fully understand how you uncovered a conspiracy 30 years in the making, at 19 years of age, in less than a single year of investigation. Most seasoned investigators would call it impossible." Aelira met his eyes, the same eyes that had once watched her execution without a flicker of doubt, and felt, for the first time, something like peace settle over the old grief and fear that had defined her second life for so long. "I simply refuse to accept the story I was given, Your Majesty," she said quietly. "I have found, in my experience, that the people who suffer most in this world are usually the ones who trusted a smile without asking what it was hiding. I intend never to make that mistake again." The weeks that followed brought a slow, careful unmaking of everything Fedor's 30 years of quiet corruption had built: allies exposed, debts forgiven, blackmailed nobles finally freed to speak honestly at court for the first time in a generation. Ivan Solvane, true to the choice Aelira had once given him in a candlelit alcove, quietly withdrew from court politics entirely, taking up a minor posting in a distant province, never again attempting the ambitions that had once, in another life, made him complicit in murder. Grand Duchess Morgana became, against every expectation, one of House Rothskane's most steadfast allies. Her decades of misplaced grief finally transformed into fierce protective loyalty, and Kaelin Ashford steady honest. The one person who had believed her impossible truth without hesitation, remained close by her side through all of it in a way that Aelira cautiously, and then not so cautiously allowed herself to hope might become something more than friendship in its own time. Built on trust rather than desperation, she never told the Emperor the truth of her first death. Some truths, she had decided, were hers alone to carry, not out of secrecy, but out of a hard-won understanding that a second life should not be spent chasing the same love that had once destroyed her, but building something sturdier, wiser, and entirely her own. Standing on the palace balcony months later, watching the capital she had once seen burn with grief and hunger now bright with lantern light, and the ordinary, unremarkable business of a city finally at peace, Aelira Rothskane thought of the girl she had been the first time she'd stood in that garden, trusting, unguarded, utterly unprepared for the betrayal waiting 3 years down the road. She was not that girl anymore. She had died once, blind and unheard, for a crime she never committed. She had returned not for revenge alone, but for the harder, quieter work of making certain that the empire she loved would never again be so easily poisoned by a patient man's old, hidden cruelty. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be given a second chance, she said softly to Kaelin, who had come to stand beside her in the cool evening air, believing that if it ever came, they would use it simply to punish the people who wronged them. "And you?" he asked. Aelira looked out over the lantern-lit city, alive and unafraid, and allowed herself finally completely to smile. "I used mine to become someone no one could ever silence again."